see Mae Jemison. Mae Jemison will be making her first trip in space today.
Why did I want to become an astronaut? It's because I wanted to go into space. It's real simple. I always tell people, I could wait in that Nebraska cornfield with some aluminum foil on my head for E.T. to come find me and take me home, but I thought I had better chances applying to the astronaut program.
Jemison is a medical doctor from Chicago.
I'm Mae Jemison. In 1992, I made world history.
This is CNN Breaking News.
Good morning, I'm Ralph Wenke. In just a couple of minutes, the Space Shuttle Endeavour is about to be launched.
I was on that flight, and when it left the Earth, the face of the space program changed.
On board were the first Japanese citizen and the first black female astronaut, Mae Jemison.
I know that there are people who desperately need to know that they, as a young black girl growing up, can do anything that they want.
Growing up in the 1960s, right in the middle of the civil rights movement, my parents made sure I knew African American achievement was not new. Nor did the push for full rights start or end with Martin Luther King Jr. There were others who changed the world. In fact, the early 1900s saw black men like Dr. Daniel Hell Williams perform the first successful open heart surgery, and Matthew Henson reached the North Pole with Admiral Peary. So of course, my thirst for science and adventure fit right in.
Solid rocket ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of Endeavour on America's 50th space shuttle flight.
Alongside me, hidden from history, were others. African American engineers, rocket scientists, physicists, who helped build the space program of which I was part. They were hidden because in the early years of NASA, you could have counted the black professionals on your fingers.
Lyndon Johnson and Robert Kennedy was looking for a way to help integrate the South, and they saw that the space program was a federally funded program and that the Republican Party was interested in funding this program to beat the Russians to the moon or whatever. So they thought this was a good opportunity to have a federal program would be funded that they could get the high blacks into to integrate that part of the government and also influence the local community.
We think we know black history. Martin Luther King, Fannie Lou Hamer, the Montgomery bus boycott. But what does any of that have to do with the space program? You'll be surprised.
NASA's role in Southern desegregation remains an unwritten and almost forgotten chapter in the history of the space program. Two main rivers, civil rights movement and the space program, and they merged.
Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Just that in the vastness of those two separate categories, the contact got lost.
The space program concentrated its resources below the Mason-Dixon line. Cape Canaveral would be the launch center in Florida, the Marshall Space Center in Huntsville, Alabama, Mission Control, the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, Texas, and a number of smaller facilities that were spread around the South.
The South had powerful constituency in Congress.
Lyndon Johnson, for one. At the time, a senator from Texas and majority leader of the U.S. Senate, Johnson was convinced that if the South could be integrated, then Democrats would become the dominant party and a Southerner could be elected president. He embraced early civil rights legislation.
Although some men who would be president on a civil rights platform answered none. On the roll calls on that bill, there were 45. Lyndon Johnson answered all 45.
Johnson was the leader of a group of Southern Democrats who saw the space program as a main chance for their region, a chance to transform the South and, in the process, to make big headway on dealing with the problems of racial injustice in the region.
Was it intentional or deliberate act of social policy to put the agencies in the South? No. But the consequences of their being there are what made the difference. Because of the executive orders and the Civil Rights Acts, NASA as a federal entity was going to keep influencing the South.
Well, when I grew up, everything was segregated. There were white and colored, as they said, water fountains, separate restroom facilities.
2 sets of everything, one for colored and one for the white. And it was almost unsafe to move around the city because of the law enforcement.
Now it's hard times, baby, hard times everywhere I go.
Should they see a group of young black boys moving not in a way that was likened to them, they would come over and arrest you for all kinds of charges.
In my community, it was all black. In fact, I had not talked to a white person in my life until I was made to go into the service. And I walked into this barracks full of all these guys, white guys. I said, good God. I sat on my bunk. I said, how in the world will I able to identify them? They all look alike to me. You know, when you're born in a system like, well, a town like Birmingham, it's all normal to you. You know, we just consider it the way it was.
We had a city park in Huntsville, and there was a black community on 3 sides of the city park. We could not walk through the park on the way to school. Therefore, we had to walk an extra mile just to get to school. When I first started school, I had never seen a book, or magazine, or newspaper. Never seen one. I was the oldest of 10, never seen a book, a magazine, or newspaper.
Everybody travel. So as you travel, you go to the station to gas up. It'll say colored and it'll say white. The colored fountain never worked and was always cruddy. The colored bathroom was always out of order. So you had to go down the road someplace and relieve yourself. And this went on for men and women.
And so these are some of the things that we went along with until, not until, but even at the same time, the protests came along with Martin Luther King.
I would fly away from this town, mama, and I'll swear I would never come back.
The main part of our story begins in 1957.
Well, this is Times Square as the great moment approaches. The heart of the nation's largest city preparing to go mad at midnight. A tumultuous farewell to the year 1957 and
1957 was just a hellacious year. The civil rights and the space program. They began their parallel courses about 1957.
We don't remember today, but in 1957, Congress, pushed by Lyndon Johnson, passed a civil rights bill.
I think that we have a real duty as public servants to protect the constitutional rights of every American citizen. Now, I have tried to do that by implementing the constitutional rights guaranteed to every citizen with 2 civil rights bills during the 3 Congresses that I have been leader.
That passes in early September. Perfect timing. Little Rock, Arkansas, September 1957. There's an attempt to integrate the schools, particularly Central High.
Units of the National Guard are already on duty on the grounds of Central High School.
September 25th, Eisenhower sends 101st Airborne to integrate Central High.
An extreme situation has been created in Little Rock. This challenge must be met.
So you have Southern Democrat getting civil rights legislation passed that nobody else could do for 80 years. You have a Republican president sending troops into the South to bring about integration.
If resistance to the federal court order ceases at once.
And 2 weeks later, of course, the Soviets have to get involved, and they launch Sputnik.
It's the biggest story of the year, possibly the #1 story of the century. This launching of the Russian satellite, which brings into the realm of possibility all those wild science fiction stories of interplanetary travel.
There's a great irony in the story of the space program, the South, and civil rights. And that really comes in the era before Sputnik, in the late 1940s and 1950s, because Southern politicians had shown very little interest in rocket science and the potential of a space program.
The people who opposed a crash program to go to the moon were fiscal conservatives in both political parties, and their opposition was basically an opposition to large federal spending for any kind of program.
Well, I'm opposed to the passage of the tax bill for a number of reasons.
And in fact, Albert Thomas, who was the Democratic congressman who represented Houston, Texas.
Roger, Houston, Apollo 10, Roger, Houston, and Gemini 7. Houston, we've had a problem.
Houston, we're ready for the event.
Thomas waged practically a one-man crusade against the space program. I think part of what made Albert Thomas and several of his colleagues kind of change their mind was Sputnik.
It's very important to understand that you've got a continuum of activities here. In 1945, the United States explodes the atomic bomb, demonstrating our technological virtuosity. In 1949, the Soviet Union does the same thing.
President Truman's dramatic announcement that Russia has created an atomic explosion sends reporters racing for Flushing Meadow, where Russia's...
In 1952, the United States explodes a hydrogen bomb.
3, 2, 1.
In 1953, the Soviet Union does the same thing. In 1954, really, they began the crash effort to build ICBMs. Oh, by the way, the Soviet Union suddenly launches, before the United States in 1957, an orbital satellite. And now they've overtaken us.
Now, sir, what do you think about this achievement of the Russians?
I think it's a remarkable thing. My only regret is that we couldn't get there first.
Tonight, the communists have established a foothold in outer space. It is not very reassuring to be told that next year we'll put a better satellite into the air. Perhaps it will even have chrome trim and automatic windshield wipers.
Lyndon Johnson of Texas and Sam Rayburn in the House of Representatives, they understood that this was going to be big and that the space program had potential to bring in a flood of funding, and not only a flood of funding, but a kind of federal investment that would transform the South.
It is not enough just to open the gates of opportunity. All our citizens must have the ability to walk through those gates. The task is to give 20 million Negroes the same chance as every other American to learn and grow, to work and share in society.
Johnson looked to NASA to help bring the changes he sought. Throughout the 1960s, Southern Democrats like Johnson, many in charge of important congressional committees, pumped billions of dollars into NASA's southern centers.
Johnson came of age, of course, in the 1930s during the Great Depression, and many people who came of age during the New Deal and the Great Depression had this idea that Southern poverty was at the root of the system of racial injustice. He also thought that part of the reason that resistance to integration among white Southerners was so fierce was that there was so little to go around in terms of resources.
And money wasn't NASA's only weapon.
Throughout the 1960s, the government relied on the space imagery to sell it, the romance, the pioneering spirit. And in real terms, that transferred into the communities. Because this is the space age, we have to treat people better. Because we are doing this, we need a new society. We need to break up old traditional hiring and segregation habits. Suddenly, the South could step away from segregation because it was the space age, because this was a new society literally being built and shooting off into the stars.
There is no strife, no prejudice, no national conflict in outer space as yet.
When it comes to policy, there are a handful of things that the Kennedy administration is known for. The space program is certainly one of them.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon.
But honestly, Kennedy didn't talk about space or race, for that matter, very much during the 1960 campaign.
We want a defense second to none. We want a country moving ahead here at home. Last year, the Soviet Union exceeded the economic growth of this country by 3 times. Unless this country moves ahead, unless we continue to grow, unless our defenses are strong, unless we're educating our children, unless we are showing in every way that this country is first, not first but or when or if, but first, and that's what the Democratic Party wants to do in 1960. We ask your help.
They were forced onto his radar by a series of events that happened in the very early weeks of the Kennedy administration, and that really sort of tied race and space together.
Kennedy comes into office.
The torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
Promises to get the country moving again, and what do we have? Soviet Union becomes the first nation to put a human into space, and that's followed by the Bay of Pigs.
The Cuban people have not yet spoken their final piece, but there are, from this sobering episode, useful lessons for us all to learn.
He was a failing president. He had to do something.
Redstone missile is the center of world attention as Commander Alan B. Shepard Jr. watches some final preparations before the United States attempts to put its first man into space. As he contacts the base, special cameras record his reactions, something the Russians either failed to accomplish or failed to reveal. Proof was here for all to see that a democracy dares pioneer without secrets, dares defy failure without censorship.
These people are going from town to town and getting off the bus and seeking through mixed groups, Negro men and white women, to force themselves into situations which tend to inflame the local people.
The local African American church has a mass meeting to call attention to this problem. Dr. King is flown in. A mob of thousands surrounds the church and threatens to set the church on fire. Dr. King phones the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, and asks for help. And after a long series of telephone calls with the governor of Alabama, Robert Kennedy sends in the National Guard.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
But I think the time has come for the President of the United States to sign an executive order outlawing segregation or declaring it unconstitutional.
Executive Order 10925 is issued in 1961 by President Kennedy. And that's where all federal contractors have to become equal opportunity, and they have to agree in their contract to a clause that they will not discriminate.
The greatest impact is the part of that executive order that involved the contractors of those federal agencies.
Well, it's significant with NASA because when it's leasing out $2, $3, $4 billion of contracts all around the country, but especially those in the South, those contractors have to go along with it.
It will require some effort on your part. I don't think it's just a question of signing the certificates and indicating a willingness to accept people if they have the talent. I think we probably have to do more than that. We really have to go out and look for them.
I don't think that they really looked in the right place for him. You know, nobody was born a rocket scientist, or nobody graduated a rocket scientist. They graduated in math, chemistry, physics, or something like that, and was given the opportunity to come work in the space program. So I don't think NASA went and looked where the people were. Mohawks, Tuskegee, Alabama A&M, Alabama State, that was graduating mathematicians, physics, every day. And you just have to go and show those folks that there is an opportunity for you if you want to come and work at a place like NASA.
In the early 1960s, NASA was gearing up to put a man on the moon. President Kennedy was taking steps to pave the way for African Americans. These were earth-shaking changes on a national scale. But down where Morgan Watson was living, it was hard to see how they applied.
During my elementary and high school years, I picked cotton. At that particular time, the black schools had split sessions, and we were out during the fall to pick cotton. We went during the summers to chop the cotton, and during the fall to pick the cotton. As a result, we didn't have football teams or a band. I always had what I call a greasy thumb. I like to tinker with things, take them apart and put them back together. I worked in a hardware store, and the white store owner saw my report card one day and said, you know, you probably would make a good engineer. So I went to the library and started reading on engineers.
I was a child of a large family. There was 13 of us kids, and I was the first male in the family to attend college. My older brothers followed the suit of my father. He was a steel worker, and he would often tell me the difficulty of surviving in the steel mill. And I said, well, I want another way. I said, I'm going to get an education, and that's what I did. And so a friend of mine who was one of my classmates had secured a job in Selma, Alabama. I guess you've heard of Selma. He informed me that the institution, that school needed a science teacher, and I had majored in science. I was very, very happy teaching school, but my wife, she cried every day. She was in Selma. Another friend of mine who we were in school together had gotten a job at the Redstone Arsenal. And I got an application, and I left it with my wife to fill out for me. So she filled that thing out, sent it in for me, and I got a hit to come in for an interview. She shouted. She would say, yes, I told you when we got married that I'd follow you to the end of the earth, and damn it, you carried me there. So we got out of there, and that's when I moved back to Huntsville.
When I came back from the service in 1956, I applied for a job in Atlanta, and I applied for a job in Florida. I had not heard from anybody for about a couple of months. So one day Mama called me and said, you got a telegram from RCA? I said, read it, Mama. They're offering you, I think it was $76 a week. But I didn't even respond. So another 2 months passed. And Mama called again, said, you got another telegram? I said, read it, Mama. $96 a month. I said, close enough. I gave notice, a 2 weeks notice, and I headed for Florida.
Looking at NASA as a grand, if accidental, social experiment, it's an open question how much the space agency really did advance race relations in the South.
1964, according to the New York Times, only 11 blacks were part of the 1,500-member NASA workforce at Cape Canaveral at the space facility there. Well, NASA hired 5 more that summer to work, so, technically they had a 50% increase, which they would brag about, but they still only had 16 people.
And things didn't get a lot better as time went on. But still,
40 years, 50 years later, we forget. One black student in a school was an enormous leap forward. One black family in a neighborhood was an enormous leap forward from what had happened before. Did they influence racial change and change in attitudes? Yes, it did. Was it enough? that wasn't its job.
One of the things that the Kennedy administration had in mind was not only technological expertise, but also social progress, and certainly interested in progress and civil rights.
The President of the United States.
At the beginning of the Kennedy administration, NASA was actually dead last within the federal government when it came to hiring black workers. And that started to change after the unrest in Birmingham, which really rattled Attorney General Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and he started twisting the arm of Lyndon Johnson, who started twisting the arm of the head of NASA, who started twisting the arm of the head of the NASA Center in Alabama. Now, the irony of that is that the head of the NASA Center in Alabama was Wernher von Braun. And before Wernher von Braun worked for NASA, his last boss had been Adolf Hitler.
Gather round while I sing you of Wernher von Braun, a man whose allegiance is ruled by expedience. Call him a Nazi, he won't even frown. Nazi schmazi, says Wernher von Braun.
But von Braun knew how to follow orders, and so in 1963, he met with the presidents of 12 HBCUs, and a few weeks later, he opened the NASA Center's college co-op program to black students for the first time.
Equal employment opportunity in the federal government is the cornerstone of our federal merit system. However, it was not until 1961, after the issuance of several orders barring discrimination in the federal government, that President John F. Kennedy issued Executive Order 10-925, establishing a new program of equal employment opportunity in the federal service.
It was very difficult for me as a boy picking cotton in 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade to even visualize going to NASA. I knew what NASA was, and I knew about the President Kennedy's idea of putting a man on the moon, but to think that I could work there.
As federal employees, you should be mindful that the executive order, like the Civil Service Act, carries with it a strong injunction against discriminatory acts in the federal service.
We were all students at Southern University in either our junior or senior year, and we were asked by the dean of the College of Engineering if we would be willing to take a job assignment in NASA. They were establishing a new cooperative education program whereby we would be in school one semester and work at NASA in Huntsville for the other semester.
If we are to extend man's boundary to the outer reaches of the universe, it is imperative that we also resolve man's relationship with man on this earth.
Today, I have stood where once Jefferson Davis stood and took an oath to my people. It is very appropriate that from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum for freedom, as have our generation of forebears before us done time and again down through history.
Alabama was not a very good place if you didn't know your way around, shall we say, in the 60s.
I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
I started at NASA in the spring semester of 1964. There were no apartments or hotels or anything that would allow us to live there. Everything was segregated. So they found us rooms with people in the community. So it was quite an experience. It was like being in an extended family. We got very close to the people. They had children themselves, but they would rent a room or two in their house for us to live.
As a student, I
I was working in the quality assurance laboratory. Quality assurance was responsible for testing all of the components on a daily basis for temperature, pressure, how they would react in space, and so forth. I went into the propulsion and vehicle engineering. This is where the test of the engine actually took place, all the way from the paper test, the paper design, all the way to static firing.
To perform our nation's most ambitious exploration of this decade, a manned exploration of the moon, the Saturn V space vehicle is under development by NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center and the country's industrial might.
Static firing, you get an actual chance to see how the engine would perform in the Earth's atmosphere and wherever it was assigned to work. At the time, they were done right on the site at the Marshall Space Flight Center, out at the back, way in the back, and it was a sight to see. You know, the engine is the rocket is tied down, and the engines are firing. And it's smoking. Oh yeah, it's quite exciting. Yeah, quite an experience. A lot of noise too.
Oh, I'm sure.
In addition to those 11 African American technicians at Cape Canaveral, there were 30 in Houston out of a workforce of nearly 5,000. To be fair, NASA, and especially the Marshall Space Flight Center, did try to hire black workers, but it said it couldn't find them.
Von Braun made a sincere effort to try to hire more African Americans, but nonetheless, his response really was that there were problems in trying to do so here, in part because when NASA and Marshall in particular tried to recruit in the North, it was very hard, given Alabama's reputation, to recruit African Americans to come to Huntsville.
They didn't want to because of the image Governor Wallace had depicted. Very few people, black and white, neither one wanted to come to Alabama.
You think that the situation that existed on this side of the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Sunday was a riot? The Negroes were standing in a line waiting and asking to have a word with your troopers, sir.
Mr. Benton, and I want to say again that my orders have always been to use a minimum amount of force. No force if necessary. For goodness sakes, don't let anybody get hurt. I've said that over and over and over. That's all.
Was the amount of force used last Sunday the minimum required?
Was it the minimum required? That matter at the present time, as a result of the charges of police brutality, is under investigation, but I'm not going to be stampeded or blackjacked, as Mr. Johnson said, into making any accusations against the police because some outside agitators themselves have accused us of police brutality.
The bombings, the killings, the shooting of the people on the buses. I called up and talked to a fella. He says, "Do what? Coming south? Are you crazy?"
I went on a recruiting trip for NASA, and I found quite a few. And some came and left the next day.
And Morgan Watson says, you also can't discount the North-South cultural divide.
If you're raised in an integrated society in Chicago or New York or wherever, coming to the South was like going to a battleground. You'd just as soon go to Vietnam and die on foreign soil rather than die in America.
And there's maybe another less recognized problem that contributed to the tiny size of NASA's African American Science and Engineering Corps. Dr. Frank Crossley was one of the Navy's first black commissioned officers. He spent most of his career working in aerospace.
There's an absence of role models as close relatives of African Americans in fields other than chemistry. When a young person has a close relative who is in an engineering field, they feel comfortable in entering that field because if Uncle Harry can do that, then certainly I can do it.
The work of Dr. Carver is well known. While at Tuskegee, he has contributed much to the science of nutrition.
George Washington Carver, because of his national reputation, provided a role model in the area of chemistry, and to the best of my knowledge, all of the black colleges offered majors in chemistry.
But Dr. Crossley says few offered degrees in engineering, and engineers were what NASA was looking for.
When I have attended national and international meetings in my field, which is metallurgical engineering, I think I've encountered only 2 African Americans at such meetings over the years.
African American college students in the South were so obstructed by the racism in their communities that they didn't even think about the space program.
They wanted to go north because they thought that's where the opportunities were. In fact, one of my guys that grew up with me, he went to Tuskegee, and he was a brilliant guy. And he graduated and went to work for IBM up in Rochester, New York. And My thinking, and probably the thinking of a lot of other people at that time, was if a guy this brilliant can't get a job in the South, I certainly can't, so I need to be looking to go somewhere to work in the North also. And I don't know how well he was recruited to go work for NASA, but he certainly was the person that had the background and capabilities that NASA needed.
Job options for blacks in the late 50s and early 60s, especially in the South, were unmercifully restricted by custom and in some cases by law.
The basic job that you can get back then was janitorial. If you could cook, you could cook.
If you stayed in the South and you went to college, the best you could be would be a teacher.
Janitor, concrete work, but you couldn't be the boss.
My great-grandfather was a railroad man or a farmer, and most of that was what we call sharecropper or whatever.
Sharecroppers, yes.
The prospects were so dim for black engineers in the South that Frank Crosley says young African Americans planning careers in that field always had to have a plan B.
Well, I decided I would study engineering, and if I couldn't get a job as an engineer, I would either go to Canada or Mexico. Canada had the virtue of speaking English, and Mexico had the virtue of having colored people.
Another problem was rooted in NASA's outreach effort.
They sent out primarily white recruiters. It would be a difficult problem for black recruiters to talk to a person coming back to Huntsville. They sent out white recruiters, and they end up with basically zero.
So you're sending a white recruiter from basically a white agency in this case into a black college to convince black men that they should move to Florida or they should stay in Alabama, possibly even go to Mississippi. Nobody talked to them.
So I went up to University of Arkansas and worked on mathematics and what we call applied mathematics. Then while I was there, NASA came through recruiting. And you probably run into Charles Smoot. Smoot was up there, and I'd never met him before, and he was recruiting, and he was telling me about he had Marshall Space Flight Center at that time. And then I asked Smoot, I said, what is it like down in Alabama? Now, we heard about your governor and all those people, you know. He said, well, it's going to be in Huntsville, and about 100 miles north of Birmingham. It's a little bit different. I said, well, how much different, you know? Then I went back and told my wife, I said, you want to go to Alabama? She said, no, I don't want to go to Alabama. I said, well, that's what I got offered, to go down to Huntsville, Alabama. And she said, you sure you want to go? I said, let's give it a try.
So Huntsville wasn't the worst of NASA's southern installations. No, to find that, you'd have to look in the place you'd least expect.
Let's look at Florida, that most southern projection of the USA, which has been variously known as the Peninsula State, the Sunshine State, and even the Mermaid State. For the uninitiated, the mere mention of the word Florida calls up a kaleidoscopic mental picture of flamingos and alligators, boating, bathing beauties, and bottles of suntan oil.
Florida has this highly cultivated image as tourist paradise, with bathing beauties and postcards of alligators and wish you were here. But a part of Florida history that really has never been publicized is its record of lynchings. Florida had the highest per capita rate of lynching of any southern state, which means you were more likely to get lynched if you were a black person living in Florida than any other southern state.
Boating, fishing and swimming, golf, tennis, riding, Florida's famous vacation towns provide them all.
Today, people think of Central Florida, and the two things that come to mind are Disney World and Cape Canaveral. But what shocked me was to find out just how powerful the Klan was in Central Florida.
In fact, the part of Florida where the Klan was strongest was in the area surrounding Cape Canaveral.
Going back to the 20s, they used to have Klan parades. They had a junior Klan for young people. The Klan basically ran those counties, particularly Orange County, the home today of Orlando and Disney World. The sheriff of Orange County was a known Klansman. They had elected officials, city commissioners, county commissioners, local businessmen joined the Klan almost like joining the Rotary Club. In fact, one local businessman told the FBI that probably 75-80% of all businessmen belong to the Klan.
Florida, orange blossom of the South.
Many in the federal government hoped that by bringing jobs into Florida, they would tone down this kind of thing. They also hoped that the extra jobs that came with NASA's arrival in Florida would help the black community. But near Cape Canaveral itself, the arrival of the space program actually had the opposite effect at first. Rockets had been launched from Cape Canaveral since 1950. When the space race began, the government bought up much of the rest of the land around the old missile base, creating what is now called Kennedy Space Center. And in doing so, a flourishing African American community was wiped out.
There was a lot of history there, and there was a lot of black people doing things that I don't see written anywhere.
It turns out the place where I and the other astronauts left the Earth for space was once an all-black community called Allenhurst.
It was a segment between Titusville and Oak Hill. Back then, blacks had a lot of property over there. There was a lot of industry over there.
There were orange groves run by African Americans. There was a thriving black-owned fish processing industry. The area had its own black entrepreneurs. Theodis Ray says NASA's arrival ended all of that.
When the government came in and bought all this land, they bought the 80,000 acres, it wiped us out. I mean, you had these fishermen, that was their livelihood. Most of them didn't have education, and all they did was fish. After the NASA come in and bought all that property, then I started working out there as a janitor. And I worked there for many years until I was drafted into the Marine Corps. Come out of the Marine Corps, I went back on the Space Center, but not as a janitor. Even though they offered me the job back, but I was too evil to take that job. So I left there, and I signed up with a company out of Texas, LTV. It's a technical company. I went from one contract to another into logistics.
As a federal agency, NASA couldn't discriminate. But there's plenty to suggest that, even with all the protections in place, NASA in the South was still in the South. When it came to a fight between federal rules and local customs, NASA retiree Clyde Foster is emphatic who won.
Local custom.
That custom hit Julius Montgomery right in the face when he showed up for his first day at work.
It's all used to being around white guys because I've been working with white guys all my life. I was always the only one. Anywhere I went, I was the only one. When I came back from the service in 1956, I went to 6-week schools because they had, space program had altogether different type skills, timing, radar, telemetry, and we were trained. And that's how we were able to start work at RCA. In 1956, I worked in the development lab, and I was a strange person coming into an all-white building, all white. And the first day I was there, nobody would shake my hand. I got to the last fellow, he's a Navy chief, and he had retired, and he decided to work for RCA. So he was the last one I got to. And I said, "How are you?" I'm Julius Montgomery. And boy, you don't talk to a white man like that. I said, forgive me, oh great white bastard. I really did say that. I don't know why I said that, but I did. And he laughed, I laughed, and then we shook hands. Now that later on, I've been there for a while, a few more guys did shake my hands. And so I said, look, I'm part of the educational program to train you guys to act like people. You've been acting like rednecks all your life. You need training, retraining.
I found a memo when I was doing research in the NASA history files that proves that the Southern Centers didn't hire black women to do anything other than secretarial work. It was a report where every single one of the centers talked about their outreach to blacks in 1963, and with the Southern Centers, every time they mentioned women, they talked about typists and secretaries. So how does that square with the story in Hidden Figures?
You have identification number?
NASA, sir.
NASA? I had no idea they hired.
There are quite a few women working in the space program.
Least I can do is give y'all an escort.
Well, the women in Hidden Figures weren't hired by NASA. There was an organization called NACA, or it's sometimes called NACA. NACA tested airplanes to see if they were safe. There was a NACA office in Ohio and one in Virginia, which is where all those women worked. So in 1958...
Members of the NACA staff, this is my first opportunity to greet you as Deputy Administrator of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. It is a very great pleasure to introduce the Administrator of NASA, Dr. T. Keith Glennon.
Thank you, Hugh. First, let me say that I have long been familiar with NACA's traditions and accomplishments. One of the real incentives underlying my acceptance of this job as NASA's first administrator was the knowledge that NACA would be the first and most substantial unit to be absorbed into NASA.
NACA became part of NASA.
As of the close of business on Tuesday, September the 30th, the shift from NACA to NASA will become official.
That is how Katherine Johnson got to do the math for John Glenn.
What do you guys do for NASA?
Calculate your launch and landing site.
And the reason why she was the only black woman doing that kind of work is because NASA didn't hire another black woman in the South to do math until the mid-1960s.
See, I worked in the OSO lab when I signed on with NASA. And there was a black woman in the head office, Dorothy Holloway, who was a receptionist. And she just answered the telephone. That's all she did.
But he said, you fill out the application, I bring it to you, and I take it out to personnel, see what happens. Well, I did. And they responded and said I was highly qualified, but they didn't have any vacancies. Well, I applied again, same thing, applied 3 times, same answer. I didn't understand that. How can you be qualified and they keep not having a vacancy for you? And I knew they were looking for co-ops. My mother was a domestic. She worked for some very influential people over in Gunnersville, like Art Sanderson's wife. And when my mother told them, I was having trouble getting on after I graduated. And she said, tell her to go over and talk to Art because I know that they are looking for minorities. And so I went over there and I talked to Art. Art set me up some interviews. First interview didn't go too well because he didn't want to talk about anything but my music. I see you take music. Do you sing? Can you sing? And after a few questions like that, I just said, I don't understand. That's not what I'm interviewing for. So he got a little irritated and said, you think I'm going to hire you? Got up and left. So I got up and went to Art and told him what happened. So he set me up another interview with Bob Smith, who was a meteorologist. A great man, best boss you could probably ever have. He hired me.
These were the years when Morgan Watson first arrived at Marshall Space Flight Center, where he and his compatriots were the first black engineers.
At the time we were there were no black professionals at all. I remember some groundskeepers and janitors, but as far as professionals, there wasn't none. So we wore our ties and shirts every day to sort of stand out. And we were sources of curiosity by everybody. The people that were there wanted to know who we were and where we came from.
The other blacks who were at Marshall mostly worked in lower-paying jobs. They were actually qualified to do much more sophisticated and higher-paying work. But as retired NASA Deputy Administrator Jim Jennings explains.
When they first graduate from school with full degrees in the technical areas, math, chemistry, they were actually brought into the government as technicians. They weren't brought in as full professionals.
In order to advance their careers, they had to take classes, advanced training. NASA offered the classes, but always off the base, in a hotel or at the white university. This being the South.
We weren't allowed in public facilities. And we were not allowed to go to the motels and hotels or any other public place.
This particular insult started to eat at Clyde.
You feel like you are a piece of dynamite ready to explode. And the only thing it takes was but a little fire. Cigarette butt.
Elsewhere in the South, people were getting fired up, but Clyde decided it wasn't enough just to get mad. He took action. He worked his way up the chain, and doggedly and with persistence, he convinced NASA to hold a second, separate but equal set of training courses at Alabama A&M, the all-black college in Huntsville.
I was able to go out to Alabama A&M and spent 2 years in developing the first computer sciences degree in the state of Alabama.
For the first time, thanks to Clyde Foster, black NASA employees could advance. But still, NASA's impact went beyond that. NASA was able to help establish a black middle class, creating families with enough resources that they could start building better neighborhoods. As an example, Morgan Watson remembers an all-black enclave called Triana outside the gates of the Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama.
It was an all-black town with outdoor toilets, and civilization hadn't quite made it there yet. That was the old South.
Clyde Foster lived in Triana.
And we had terrible condition here. No public water system, no lights, no paved streets. It was terrible. And I said, now we're going to the moon, like we could have some of the basic needs for the community here.
His wife told him that she had heard from friends that the neighborhood had once been a city.
I said, you out of your mind, girl. What are you talking about? It's a city. I don't see any, not a stoplight, nor a stop sign.
But Foster was intrigued, and he decided to look into it.
I told a girl to put on a hat and shoes. We're going to go down to Montgomery, Alabama. I went to the archives in the state of Alabama and discovered that this had been a municipality and never been dissolved.
The area had, in fact, been incorporated in 1819.
And I said, hold on, Michael.
Clyde had been trying unsuccessfully to get the area purified water. He had been turned down by the state and by the USDA.
When I found out this was a town, I said the easiest way to do is let's incorporate the town. And town will now be eligible for some grants that you don't have to pay back. And I went back to Alabama A&M and got with some of the professors over there. And I asked him to advise me how could we reestablish that charter.
They applied to a judge to get the charter reinstated. The judge agreed. Clyde got himself elected mayor of Triana, and then the action really got started.
If you remember that photograph I sent to you with the original town of council of Triana, we later on was able to build a new city hall, $750,000, but it was a complex of many activities. We had an administrative office, fire department in there, a jailhouse, air conditioning, daycare, gymnasium.
He appointed a black sheriff. The people elected a black city council. All of this set off a chain reaction in other small black communities around Alabama.
Challenge with the job that we were trying to do is to get a man on the moon. I didn't fear anything that I couldn't do. It gave me that desire to do more. I said, if now we can do this in space, we certainly can do it here.
Blacks working at NASA were breaking down barriers in Florida too. A white scientist named Jerry Cooper had decided to start a technical school. When the college was first starting, the plan was to hold classes in a county high school until they could get their own building. Julius Montgomery signed up to be one of the school's first students, and on his application, he wrote down that he got his undergraduate degree from Tuskegee Institute. When county school officials saw that, they called Cooper in for a meeting.
He was told, "I'm sorry, but this fellow here is from Tuskegee, so he must be black. He cannot come to this classroom." So shortly after, I was called by the manager, Julius Montgomery. "Come to the office, please."
The manager introduced Julius Montgomery to Jerry Cooper.
I said, "Yes, Dr. Cooper. What can I do for you?" He said, "Well, I need your help." Well, the help he needed was to take my name off that list so he can start his new college.
In a remarkable act of absolute selflessness, Julius agreed.
For the better good of everybody, I took my name off the list, and that's how I got to know Dr. Cooper. So we became friends. He said, "As soon as I get my own buildings, you are welcome." And that was true, he did.
Not only that, since 2006, the school, now called Florida Institute of Technology, has presented the Julius Montgomery Pioneer Award for Community Leadership. Daring and commendable as these moves on race might be, there was plenty of room to fault NASA for its record on race. But Morgan Watson credits NASA with ending the flight of the black middle class from the South.
The space program certainly helped change the South. Not only NASA, but the whole federal government laid the groundwork from the military on for blacks to be integrated into the workplace.
He says because NASA represented the future, because NASA was a place where only the best and the brightest worked, because it took the time and trouble to find a place for people like him who grew up chopping cotton in the old South to build spaceships to go to the moon, NASA did fulfill the hopes of those who saw it as a way to break down America's firmest racial barriers.
By showing that there were black professionals who could do that, you proved the fact that people were available that could do it. It helped to break the walls down. It helped change people's perception of black people in the South.
And once the walls came down, people could begin to treat each other not as black and white, but as co-workers. Julius Montgomery, who couldn't get that man to shake his hand the first day at work, he kept on pushing, and in the end, they actually became friends.
And in fact, when he left, he gave me a gift, little white dog. White dog. And we call him Whitey.
When the shuttle Endeavour blasted off from the Kennedy Space Center, it landed in the record books several times over.
So here we are back, the sounds of my shuttle flight. As an astronaut training at Marshall Space Center in Huntsville, I used to comment on the confluence of events that brought me here. Born at the beginning of the space race and the modern-day civil rights movement in Decatur, Alabama, right next door to Huntsville. And oh yeah, my father was a roofer on the construction of the Redstone Arsenal. Instinctively, I knew that without having any of those events, my journey into space might not have happened. Not because I wouldn't have had the potential, skills, education, and drive for exploration. Many Black American women did before me. But because the country had to finally arrive at the right place to recognize and take advantage of the talent of all of its citizens. NASA and its contractors have African American, Hispanic, and Asian engineers, scientists, technicians, flight surgeons, and other personnel, and of course astronauts, at centers not just in the South, but around the nation. But there's still more work to do, and the tale continues.